Welcome, ladies. It's a privilege. Shh. Ladies, we're going to start. Okay. Welcome. It's so nice to see all your beautiful faces. Welcome to my Zoomers. I'd like to talk about Purim today. The title of the class is Unmasked. I'd like to dedicate our class today to the women, the men, the children that dedicate hours upon hours in making Bikur Cholim the institution that it is for our community. This place, this building, this institution is really something that would move your heart if you only knew 10% of what they do here. We're going to talk a little bit about the work of Bikur Cholim, but we're going to do it through the lens of the Megillah and of the women who are highlighted in the Megillah. And I said women because there aren't that many women. There's Esther, and if you're lucky, Zeresh, maybe Vashti, who has a short stint.
Say hi.
But the truth of the matter is, something very interesting happens when we read the Megillah. So I'll give you a little bit of a background. Most of you know the story of Purim. Achashverosh is the king. He has a minister named Haman. He has a wife named Vashti who refuses to come to a party that he makes. And she is dethroned at best. We don't know exactly what happens to her. And when King Achashverosh is feeling lonely, his young ministers recommend that he find another wife. They have what would be considered a beauty contest today. Esther, whose name is Hadassah, which means hidden. Esther is the one who's chosen to be his new queen. And Haman at this point comes up with this idea that since he has been promoted and everybody in the kingdom is bowing down to him and Mordechai is not bowing down to him, he decides that he wants to do away with the Jewish people. I'm just giving you a quick background to the story. A date is picked, and there is crying and anguish throughout the land. The Jewish people, there has been an edict that was written that the Jewish people are allowed to be utterly lehashmid, to destroy, le'abed, to make as if they never existed. And on top of it, the decree says that when you destroy them, you're allowed to take their property. So if your incentive of anti-Semitism wasn't enough, you could also get rich off of this opportunity. You could loot their homes and take what they have. Just giving you this background because it's very, very sad, of course, that in every generation, there are people who want to rise up against us. But this Megillah is not just about that. The Megillah is going to have a happy ending and is going to have Mordechai ride around on the king's horse in the king's clothes. And there's going to be a happy ending. Ora v'simcha, sason v'ikar. Everybody's going to be dancing and singing. And yes, it does say at the end of the Megillah that we took upon ourselves the Torah. So some people say this is a second receiving of the Torah. But the point that I'd like to speak with you about today is something that's not often so highlighted. So before we get started, there is a beautiful custom that suggests that when Mashiach comes, the only sefer that is going to be read is going to be Megillat Esther. That's a big statement. And we have to ask ourselves, what's so great about Megillat Esther that this is the book that's going to endure for all time? So I noticed in reading the Megillah something interesting. In chapter 8, Esther comes before the king and she falls before the king, vatipol, which is an unusual word because we know that she wasn't clumsy or klutzy, that she would just fall. I don't think it was a misstep that she took. Falling in Torah usually means, and if somebody's going to fall in front of somebody, it usually means that they are going to be in a vulnerable position. They're going to be in a position where they are showing that they are in complete need of assistance from this person. But the interesting thing is, she falls in chapter 8. By chapter 8, the king already gave his ring to Mordechai. Letters have already been sent out that the Jews could defend themselves. By chapter
Vivien, you're on mute. Vivien, you're on mute. Vivien?
Megillat Esther as being a book for all time, we're going to take a little journey. I'm going to paint for you 6 little pictures, vignettes. You know what a vignette is? A little story. And these 6 little stories are going to tell one big story. And the big story is going to tell the story of the Jewish people, the story of us women as matriarchs, and it's going to tell the story of Bikur Cholim, all at the same time. So I'd like to start with the first woman in Torah that ever fell. And I'd like to see if we could understand what the Megillah is trying to tell us. When the Megillah comes and tells us that Esther fell, and we don't understand not the placement of it, why she's falling at that point when there's already a happy ending on the horizon. And we know that the Megillah is written in cryptology. It's written cryptically. We don't really understand. Again, it was written at a time where if we would have said that the king Achashverosh was evil and he allowed for the Jewish people to be killed so that his treasuries could get filled, would this book ever come to print? Would we be able to see these words today? So the authors had to be very careful. They had to write things in a certain way so that those who are in the know, what do we know? We know Torah, and it's written to people who know Torah. So if it's going to use certain words or certain phrases, the ones you might be familiar with is, we know every time it says Hamelech, we should be thinking to ourselves, not just is it King Achashverosh, but it's Melech Malchei Melachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's God himself who's acting, because his name appears nowhere in the story. We don't see the name of God at all. So back to where we started, if we take this one little concept, this one little idea, that Esther is going to fall and that this book is going to endure forever, then we have to say, what did the author, and who might the author be? It could have been Daniel, because he was a prophet at that time. It could have been Mordechai, or Esther herself. It's Megillat Esther, so maybe she wrote it. Maybe it was a collaboration. But regardless, when they use language, it's so that we could connect dots. It's the only way the Megillah has for us to say, wait a minute, this story of Rivka, I gave it away, but anyway, the story of Esther falling says way more than you might think it says. Now, I told you that it's written in code. Every code has a key. What's the key to the Megillah? What's the key to unlocking what they really wanted to say, but they had 2 hands tied behind their backs because they couldn't really say everything because it would be censored. It would be canceled. We're familiar with those terms today, unfortunately. Even Esther herself, in Magedet Moladeta, she doesn't say who she is or where she's from. So there's a sense of discretion at that time, and then the Megillah is going to use the same discretion. So when it says that Esther fell, The Torah is intending for us to use this tool. I always say the Torah can't bold itself or italicize itself or highlight itself. All the letters are the same size, most, except Vayikra last week, if you remember the little aleph. And there's a couple more like that. But for the most part, the letters are all the same size, the same thickness, nothing's underlined. So how could a little Megillah deliver a message to us that's going to stand the test of time, that's going to speak to every one of us today in this room? And I'll tell you, this one little word today, tomorrow we may pick a different word, but today we're only going to focus on this one word, vatipol, and see what the significance is of that. So when Esther falls, what do the authors want us to do immediately? They want us to notice that she shouldn't be falling at this point. This is not the place and time for her to be falling, because the redemption is practically there already. But they have her fall here because they want us to connect it to the first woman who ever falls. And that woman is Rivka. And when does Rivka fall? What's her story? Because this is what we have to do. We have to start to weave together. I'm going to bring you a bunch of ladies who are going to fall. And those ladies represent every one of us. And those ladies represent our mission. So Rivka starts out her story. We know she comes from Haran. She's brought over by the servant of Abraham. And no sooner does she see Yitzchak approaching, and she's told that he's the man that she's going to marry. The kids love this when you teach this in second grade. They love this part. What does she do? She was sitting on top of a camel. She lifts up her eyes, and what does she do? She falls splat. She falls off the camel, and the kids get a kick out of it. It's great. You know, Torah has a sense of humor. A woman, they don't have to tell you every detail, but they took the time to record the detail that Rivka fell down. What do we need? I mean, it's not for our entertainment pleasures. There's something being said. Rivka, the woman who we compare to Abraham, the woman who did her own Lech Lecha, the woman who leaves her family, her father's house, her birthplace. She goes to an unknown place to complete the mission of the Jewish people. This woman is going to fall, and this woman is going to represent, or Esther is going to represent this woman. What does Rivka really represent? There are so many facets to Rivka that connect us to Esther. So an easy facet, an easy piece is we know that Esther is going to replace Vashti, who was the queen of how many provinces? Sheva Esrim Umea Medina, 127, which happens to be like Rivka, who's going to, it says that she took the place, she went to Sarah's tent, and Yitzchak was comforted from his mother. So she's going to take the place of Sarah. And how old was Sarah when she died? She was also 127. And so now we start to see that if we went from Sarah to Rivka, Esther is a progression. And not only Esther is going to be a progression, but by the time we finish this little journey through all these vignettes, the Torah is going to be telling us that every one of us is supposed to be the Esther of our story, of our generation, of our time. What does it take to be a matriarch? What are the ingredients to be an Esther, to be a Rivka, to be a balabasta? What are those ingredients that we need? Well, Rivka picks up where Sarah left off. If you'll remember, Sarah was the one to tell her husband to get rid of Hagar. What does she do? She finds her voice And she's able to continue the sanctity of the Jewish people by making a suggestion to who? To her husband, and telling her husband, I don't like what I see going on over here. So I don't know if you're following me, but Sarah takes her voice and uses it to command her household. Rivka uses her voice, and she's the first one who actually is really beautiful in Torah. If I asked a trivia question, who's the first woman to have a conversation with her son? It's Rivka. The matriarch doesn't just communicate with the husband. Who does the matriarch communicate with? Her son. These are parts of what the Megillah is trying to tell us. And why is this so important at this point? Because Esther is going to have to find her voice. Because Mordechai says, Esther im hacharesh tacharishi. If you're not going to find your voice, if you're going to remain silent, what's going to happen? This is a lesson for all mamas everywhere. If something's wrong, silence could be deadly. I know, Bikur Cholim, one of the things that they do is they have intervention, early intervention. They listen, they hear, they want to know. They don't cover their eyes and cover their ears, quite the opposite. And they want to be involved in rectifying situations to bring together a happy home and ultimately a healthy community. So if we take our little Vatipol word, we have to say, what is Esther really doing? She's picking up where Sarah left off, where Rivka left off, but she doesn't just do that, because what's so beautiful about her, about this word, is we see it appear again. It doesn't appear that many times, by the way. Women falling, you'd think women falling 1 or 2. We're going to have 7. So the next woman who we're going to encounter, if anybody wants to poke a guess at it, is going to be Ruth from our Shavuot story. What are we doing now? We're marrying Esther's story to the Ruth story. When does Ruth fall exactly? Let's go back a little bit. Let's talk about her story, because every one of their stories is our story. Ruth is a Moabite. She comes from another land, and she's an outsider, clearly. What does she say about herself when Boaz, well, let's just talk about this woman, because she's a woman. What does she do? She's also an Abraham. She leaves her parents. She leaves her home. She goes to a place that she doesn't know. She's taking a chance. And who's she going with? She's going with her mother-in-law, who's depressed morning, noon, and night. She says, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, misery. That's my name. I'm in a bad mood today, tomorrow, the next. Every day is a bad day. That's who she's choosing to go back. And when she gets there, nobody's having a parade for her. When she gets there, she's now at best, second-class citizen. She has to go glean in the fields. The commentaries say she was actually a Moabite princess. So for her to go from having a porcelain doll collection and having a silver spoon in her mouth to gleaning in the scorching fields, that's pretty tough. But what is the Torah telling us about Ruth? First, it tells us what she says about herself. When Boaz pays her attention, she says, why are you paying me attention? I'm nothing but a foreigner. That's how she first sees herself. And as long as we see ourselves as a foreigner, an outsider, a person who's down on their luck, a person who's degraded, demoted, as long as we see ourselves as that, where are we going to go? We're only going to go down and we're going to get worse. And he tells her, don't call yourself that. Don't call yourself a foreigner and an outsider. I know what you did. What did you do? This is for us to learn every single day. If we're down in the dumps and we think we're worthless and we think we're nothing, what's going to pick us up? How does he allow her to pick herself up? You know what he tells her? I heard about the chesed that you did with your deceased husband and with your mother-in-law. This is telling us right here, right now, when you're feeling down, think to yourself, I may have a lot of things that are not going my way. I may be in a place that's dark and gloomy right now. And I may not be so perfect either. But could I think of one good thing that I did? I'm not asking you to think of 100 great things, but if you want to turn the switch from dark to light, all you need is one. Think of one good thing that you did. And then you might start to feel differently about yourself. And so what is Esther? Esther also in her story, she en la avaim. She's a little bit Ruth-esque. She could have said to herself what Ruth said, which is what? In those days, just so we know, the way marriages took place amongst the monarchy, it was usually for convenience. Who was Vashti? Nebuchadnezzar's granddaughter. She was the real queen. One day, if we have time, we'll talk about why Ahasuerus had such an inferiority complex and why he was so threatened and why he felt the need to show off is because he was really what? He wasn't Queen Elizabeth. He was the plus one. He's as if he's the king, but he wasn't really the king. The true blue blood was who? Vashti. Now Esther comes into the picture, and what is she saying? How am I going to go to the king? He has not, if he was able to dethrone Nebuchadnezzar's granddaughter, who really had blue blood, then who am I? What am I? And what is Esther do? And what do we have to do? Every time we think we can't, take one step. Take one step forward. Let me show up. I'll show up. I don't know. I'm going to show up at the door. He may not hand me his scepter. He may say off with her head. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to show up. Ruth shows up. Esther shows up. A matriarch is a person who doesn't think about what she doesn't have. A matriarch is not a person who thinks about how hard life has been for her. A matriarch is a person who keeps pushing and plowing forward because she knows what's at stake. Especially, she knows that her family is at stake. The next woman that we're going to encounter, she's actually, I'm going to keep saying this about each one, I'll try not to, but she's one of my favorites, is Abigail. You know who Abigail is? You know how she becomes the wife of David? So I'll tell you a quick little story. This is vignette number 3. So we went to Esther, then actually number 4. Went to Esther, went to Rivka. We spoke a little bit about Ruth. Now I'd like to talk to you about Abigail. So it happens to be that David has workers, and his workers are taken by this man called Naval HaKarmeli. He's a bad guy. And they have an exchange. And to make the long story short, David is so upset with Naval HaKarmeli for stealing his employees that he's going to wage war and attack him. Who's this guy, Naval HaKarmeli's wife? Our Abigail. The bad guy's wife, Abigail, what does she do? She sees that David and his army is poised at her husband and her household. She knows her husband is not a good man. He's a ben Belial. The text calls him a not good person. And what is she supposed to do? You know what she does? She bakes cakes. Anybody know a matriarch who's not in the kitchen morning, noon, and night? She's baking cakes. She takes wine and bread and date cakes, I believe. And what does she do with them? Now, again, let's talk about this for a minute. We're talking medieval times. Women don't just go out at night. She wasn't calling an Uber. She wasn't calling Uber Eats and having them deliver it to David. She herself carries wine and bread and takes it to King David. And what does she say? She says, we both have something in common. You know, like I know, that my husband is a bad person, or that my husband did a bad thing. That's probably the more correct way to say it. But you know what else? God sees everything. This is Abigail. This is the wife who takes it upon herself to go in the middle of the night to speak to David. And what does she say? David, you're going to be the next king, for goodness sakes. Do you want that man's blood on your hands? Is that what you want? And guess what? David hears her. And what is a matriarch like Abigail here to tell us? You have a little oil in your kitchen? You have a little flour in your kitchen? What do you have? What's in your cupboard? I don't just mean your physical cupboard of your kitchen. I do. But I also mean that everybody has something in their cupboards, in their proverbial cupboards. What wisdom do you have? What tools? You could never say you have nothing. Because Abigail, a woman in those times, did not own anything. She was owned by her husband. And yet she found the wherewithal to come up with a plan, to come up with a scheme, to come up with a strategy. That's an Eshet Chayil. That's a matriarch. That's what's going to bring the next generation to be. And since you convinced David, guess what happens? She goes back home. He never has war. And what happens? Naval dies of a heart attack. And Abigail, says his heart turns to stone. And Abigail, you know what happens to her? David calls for her and marries her. So that's how you knew her to be the wife of King David. The next story is pretty interesting as well. So this is, oh, I forgot to tell you the most important part about Abigail and why I even highlighted her is because she falls at the feet of King David. So it seems to be that when these women are always falling on their feet, can we start to make a little bit of a connection that they're not just falling in front of the physical person, the physical power, the physical decision maker? Who else are they falling in front of? Of course, they're falling in front of Hashem as well. And so they're going to each have a common denominator where these women know two things: that the direct person in front of them holds the keys to the resolution, and as well, the resolution cannot happen without Hashem. This next story is a beautiful one. This woman doesn't have a name. She's called an Isha Tekoit, a woman from Tekoa. Who is this woman from Tekoa? Anybody ever hear of her before? I'll give you a little bit of a background story for the sake of time. David had banished one of his sons, Absalom. He did a very bad thing. He killed his brother. It was a mess, but not for today's story. But he banished him. David's general of his army sees that the king is still longing to reconcile with his son. Even though his son did a bad thing, He wants to reconcile with him, but he can't bring himself to do that. And so the general, Yoav, calls this woman, and this Isha Tekoit is called an Isha Chachama, a wise woman. She's going to also batipol, if you're looking to connect the strand, she's also going to fall. So she comes and falls before the king, and the king says, what's your story and how can I help you? And she comes up with a parable. She comes up with a story, an analogy to have the king realize that maybe there is a way for him to have peace in his family. And she says, I had 2 sons, and they were both in the field, and one son killed the other son. And now the townspeople want to avenge his blood, and they want to kill the living son. It's understood that it was an accident. Now, she said, I'm coming to you because the townspeople, if they were to kill my living son, then I would be what? Out 2 sons. I would be bereft of both sons. And what do you think she's saying to David? That's what she's saying. What do we think he's hearing? Bad enough, I lost 1 son. I don't need to lose a 2nd son. And what is the job of the matriarch who's going to be vatipol? What's the job of every matriarch? Shalom bayit. It's our job to see if there's a way, if there's a middle ground. I don't care how old our children are. It's our job. My mom says it every day. I don't care if you're older than me, taller than me. I don't care if you get smarter than me. I don't care if you're faster than me. I'm always going to be your mother. And a matriarch never stops being a mother. And by not stopping being a mother means what? It was your job when they were 2 and 6 to make sure that there was peace in your family. Well, guess what? It's still your job. It never ends. It never stops. And what does Esther? Now, all these women, I just want you to picture them in your mind for a minute. All these women, they joined a falling women's club. They're all anonymous, right? They all are part of this club. You could picture them all sipping tea together and comparing their stories. But these women are all different facets of women and the lives that we go through and the challenges that we go through and the job that's expected of us. So if there's a shalom bayit issue, and what does Esther say? What does she learn from this lady? What does she learn from the lady from Tekoa? She learns and she says to Mordechai, you want my meeting with the king to be successful? Lech kenos et haYehudim. What do the Jewish people have to be? United, together. So Esther and the Megillah are telling us 100 stories with one little word. I'm going to bring you to our last woman, and I think she's going to encapsulate the entire understanding that the Megillah wants to give us as to why it's going to be the enduring Sefer for eternity. So this woman, and I hope you're appreciating that the woman from Tekoa, she doesn't have a name. Esther herself, we're not sure what her name is. Maybe it's Hadassah, maybe it's Esther, but she's not saying who she is. This woman as well doesn't have a name. She's called the Shunamite woman, Hashunamit. She's from Shunam. I only know the place that she comes from. And we know that when the Torah doesn't give a name to a person, what is that an invitation for? The Torah is saying, I'm not going to give her a name because you'll think that that's her story. I'm going to leave her name blank so that you could insert your name into the story, so that you could relate to the story, so that you and the story become one. What is this story that we're intended to relate to? So this is actually a very exciting time in history. It takes place during the time of Melachim Bet, Kings 2. There's this Shunammite woman, and who comes to visit her, or who comes to town? Elisha, Eliyahu Hanavi's protege. Eliyahu Hanavi, our famous Eliyahu Hanavi, who comes to the Brit Milah, who comes to Yeseder, he has a protege named Elisha. Now, Elisha comes to Shunam very often. So what does this Shunammite woman do? She says, you know something? She tells her husband, he comes so often, we should build a little extension, make a room for him, give him a desk, a chair, a bed, a candle. Back in the day, that was major decorating. That was lush. And every time he comes to Shunam, he won't be embarrassed to come. He won't feel like he's displacing anybody. It's
Just happened. I'm losing.
he tells the woman, what can I do to repay your kindness? How can I repay your favor? And she answers, I'm good. I don't need anything. I have everything I need. Does she really have everything she needs? Elisha finds out, what doesn't she have? A child. So we're going to start to see a little bit of a pattern where Ruth didn't have a child. We're going to start to see now what takes place. Sure enough, he tells her, in 1 year's time, I'm going to come back and you're going to be with child. And sure enough, in 1 year's time, she has a child. Don't get happy yet. It's going to get sad and then it's going to get happy again. So I have to just prepare you for it. So what happens next? One day he's out in the fields working with his dad, Roshi. He has some kind of a headache. Something's hurting him. And what happens? He dies. Sheep, don't worry. It's going to be happy. It's Purim. It's Adar. Marbim besimcha. There's no way I'm going to let you leave here sad. And that's what the Megillah wants to tell us. So I'll get there in a second. She takes the child. She puts him on the bed. And she sends to call for Elisha. And Elisha works on this child. He puts his mouth to his mouth. He puts his hands to his hands. He literally lies down on top of it. He says, everybody close the door. This is, they say step aside. This is something that has to be done in private. Now, let's be clear about one thing. Before Elisha comes to work on this child, the text says clearly, the child is dead. Now, what happens in that room, I couldn't tell you, but I will tell you that by the end of the story, Elisha opens the door and tells the woman, this Shunammite woman, come and carry your child. He's alive. And what is the significance about this Shunammite woman who's going to fall in front of Elisha and beg him to revive her son with our story in the Megillah? Where do we even have any kind of a connection unless we realize that part of being a matriarch is recognizing that the physical world has its limitations, but that there is an entire another realm that operates in this world. There is another operating system that we may not be able to see. And that operating system says what, Shani? That God could always render the impossible possible. A matriarch, a woman who's gotten to the point where she's pulled her family, her husband, herself through so many challenges, recognizes and sees how often she wasn't able to do these things by herself. My mom always says, if I had to do all the things that I did all over again, I don't know if or how I could do them. I can't believe the things I've accomplished in my lifetime. If you really look back on a lifetime of accomplishments and you're able to connect the dots, you will see they weren't coincidences. They weren't lucky breaks. Those were the times where God stepped in and said, let me carry you through this part. Let me carry you over this bump. And so what does the Shunamit represent for us? That Esther and the Megillah represents for us. When you read about Esther, it wasn't just a lucky break. Of course it wasn't. We had to make it look like Achashverosh was a nice guy who changed his mind and allowed the Jews to defend themselves. Because if we didn't write it that way, what would happen? We'd have no Megillah. What is the Megillah telling us when it says that Esther fell? The Shunamit falls, Ruth falls, Rivka falls, Abigail falls. Everybody's falling. What's happening in all of these stories? He's saying, I was in every one of those stories. Who do you think was in that room with that boy to revive him? Mechayem etim. Who could do that? There's no paddles after it's pronounced game over that are going to bring that child back. And there's one thing we should know, because we're all adults, and that is that the physical world does have its limitations. And sometimes it is game over. And sometimes as individuals, we have to accept when it's game over. But we never have to accept, as a nation, game over. The game is never over for Am Yisrael. Am Yisrael Chai means we are in a constant state of living, which means we as a nation are an eternal nation. It's been promised to our forefathers, and it's been promised to us, and we are living proof of it. If you try to do the math of the probability that the Jewish people should be alive till today with everything we've been through, it defies all laws and all reason. And this Megillah, Megillat Esther, is a testament to that. It's gonna say the game on a national level is never over. As long as you remember that we are daughters of Rivka and Ruth, of Abigail, of the Shunamit, of the Tekoit, of all of these, how many more miracles do we need to see? Well, guess what? Tomorrow, actually tonight, we're going to read in the Megillah about the miracle, and the Megillah is saying, make no mistake about it. None of it was a coincidence. I may have been hidden, but that's only because you couldn't see me. I've been there all along, says God, throughout your history. I've been together with you. And the last woman who falls, I'm going to use her as a she. There's one more, but I'm not introducing her to you today. It's a gory story, but I decided to replace her with one more, air quotes, woman. It is the wall of Jericho. Vatipol hachoma, the wall, she falls. You know, I love when the Torah is going to personify a wall. It didn't crumble, it fell as a human would fall. Because what the Torah and the Megillah, the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim, the generations upon generations want to tell us is that what? You see a physical wall Could you fathom that the sound of a shofar is going to bring a wall to crumble down? That is something that we can't imagine. And you know what the Megillah is saying? Just because you can't write the ending, just because you can't imagine, how is this going to end well? I can't imagine. The child died. How is that supposed to end well? If you're Ruth, you're going to say, my mother-in-law is miserable. My husband and my brother-in-law and my father-in-law died. How's this going to end well? As long as you're asking the question, how on earth is it? And how does it end, by the way? She becomes the grandmother of David HaMelech, just to tell you, who could imagine that stuff? You can't make this stuff up. Steven Spielberg can't make this stuff up. Walt Disney can't make this stuff up. Because this is the stuff that the Torah wants to say. What's the chances that a Jewish woman is going to be on the throne at the very time that they decide they're going to destroy the Jewish people? That doesn't happen. But what is the Megillah here to remind us? In every generation, we need the shot of B12. We need a reminder. And the reminder is very, very clear. To the extent that you pull God into the story, to the extent that you fall before God and say, God, I am vulnerable. I took this as far as I could take it. I can't move any further, so I'm literally falling. At that point, when you've done everything you could do, what does God come in and say? I picked up every one of these women. I'm going to pick you up because Am Yisrael Chai, because the Jewish nation is constantly going to be in existence. And I'm never going to allow that to end. And maybe that's why Esther falls at the end of her story. She should have fallen when she had a bad story, but she doesn't. She falls at the end because the Megillah wants to tell us something else. Don't forget, when the ending is a happy one, you know, the old joke, you know, God, if you help me, I'll give you 100%, I'll give you that, and that 80%, 90%, you know, if you help me find a parking spot, whatever you want. And then, yeah, forget it, God, I got it. I found one. No, I'm good. No. What else is the Megillah here to tell us? When you get your happy ending, that's the time to vatipol. That's the time that you should recognize and realize where it came from. And so for today, I'd like to end by saying, Bizchut Nashim Tzidkaniyot. You're going to hear it a lot with the upcoming Pesach holiday. I'm starting early. It's the zechut of the women who have the belief that God's going to come through, who use what they have. You have oil, you have honey, you have flowers, use it. You have sechel, use it. And that's what Bikur Cholim is about. You know why we, the matriarchs, are perfect representation? Because every one of these matriarchs, what did they do? As much as they asked for help, they tied their shoelaces themselves, they got up, and they did whatever it is that they could do. Bikur Cholim, one of the genius approaches amongst the many that they have is what my dad used to say, you give a man a fish, he eats for one day. You teach a man to fish, he eats for life. What is Bikur Cholim doing? It's teaching people to fish. It's teaching people, whether it's their job placements, everybody has a challenge. Everybody has a hurdle. Everybody has a mountain to climb. But Bikur Cholim, the Megillah, is one and the same. You want to get to the top of that mountain? If we carry you, you'll never climb another mountain. But if you climb that mountain and we help you and we hold your hand, there'll be many more mountains for you to climb yourself. And then, you know, it's the most beautiful part of that story. When you see somebody struggling, you're going to help him climb his mountain. That's what Nashim Tzidkaniyot represents. We know Me'ashpot Yarim Evyon, that God lifts us up. Every one of us needs a lift, whether it's physical, whether it's emotional, whether it's financial. It's okay to take the help. And it's also imperative that once we're on our own 2 feet, that we look around us, we kenoset kol haYehudim, and we make sure that no man left behind, that we care for each other. That is what's going to bring the ultimate salvation, the ultimate Mashiach. Bimhera b'yameinu. Amen. Thank you for joining us today.